starting a bit late, but everybody has 10 other things they're doing, and trying to coordinate 5 people or 10 people is always a little difficult. Some months ago, just after the election, Secretary Clinton asked me to go to Bali. Now you would think, well, that's a nice place to go after an election. But it actually was the Bali Democracy Forum, which is put on by the Indonesian government. And the Indonesian government had wanted to convene the democracies in the world and not have it run by the United States, which I think was tremendous, was a great thing to do. And when the ambassador suggested that we have this forum to give people a chance to hear what's going on with democracy in the Muslim world, it made great sense to me. We're honored today by the ambassador from Egypt, Mohamed Tawfik. Ambassador, where is this? And ambassador, Libyan ambassador, Aujali, and the Tunisian ambassador, Darragi. I've been, over the course of the last few years, in all of these countries on the House Democracy Project run by David Dreyer and David Price, a bipartisan effort really to stimulate help in the parliaments, the emerging parliaments in these countries of Egypt and Tunisia and Libya, and we went a number of other places. We've been in Lebanon and a variety of places in the Middle East. One has to say that the progress of democracy is an evolutionary process. I was just reading a book last night about the title of which is "Who Are We?" Talking about our American democracy, and the author points out that we had slaves for 75 years in our country, and we had women didn't vote for 135 years in this country. So you know that we've come a long way from the start. And as we look at what's going on in the Middle East and the emergence of democracy in these countries, one has to keep in mind the evolutionary process by which we got to where we are today. Much of what you look back on as having always been here hasn't always been here. So every country is going through its own process, and I think that it's important to keep that in mind, and that's why this forum is really so helpful. I'm joined today by my good friend, Ed Royce. We travel together now and then to Africa and other places, and Ed is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. What do you call it? Is that right? Foreign Affairs? He's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, and is a long-time advocate for democracy in the world. Ed?
Thank you very much, Jim. And I also want to, of course, thank our ambassadors that are here with us today. And from North Africa to Southeast Asia, the ambassadors will outline their unique circumstances, the specific issues in their countries, and the lessons learned. But at this point, let me just say that we thank everyone here for their presentation and their involvement today. I think the advance of democracy, especially in places that many had condemned to authoritarianism, it's a very exciting development, but it's also a very daunting undertaking. And now's a good time, I think, to reflect upon what has gone right, what has gone wrong, and how the 4 countries here today can learn from one another. The ouster of President Ben Ali in Tunisia inspired a wave of popular reform movements that have replaced regimes in Libya, in Egypt, and Yemen, and frankly also threatened the stability of several additional regimes. The underlying causes of the Arab Spring have been well documented. The United Nations Arab Human Development Reports identified the need for reforms as early as 2002, but it's also very obvious to anyone who has followed the concerns of people across the region with regards to the issue of corruption. And many of you have heard the testimony of Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist who's documented the hidden wealth in societies such as Egypt, wealth held extra-legally, outside the rule of law. But the question is, why was wealth held outside the rule of law? Why could these people not have their power untapped? And the answer was the corruption, the kickbacks, the factor that led to the suicides of so many people throughout that region was the fact that in each case, the state was coming in and saying, no, you have to pay us a higher and higher kickback in order to, be a vendor, in order to sell your wares, in order to do business. And it got to the point where these families, they could not provide for their families, or their livelihood was seized by the state. It is no coincidence that the upheaval in Tunisia started with a street vendor, frustrated by a lack of economic freedom, being told you will no longer be able to practice your business because he couldn't come up with enough money by way of a kickback to the government. It is perhaps not surprising then that the Arab Spring occurred, but rather, I guess what is so surprising is that it took so long in coming. But once there was one protest, there were 50, and soon it increased arithmetically across the region. Each of the countries being discussed today has had different experiences with political reform, and each faced different obstacles. Each have additional opportunities. As states move away from the highly personal structure of the past, creating strong institutions that represent all of their citizens is the challenge for each of these societies. New governments must answer the chorus of calls for greater transparency in the legislative process, fair application of the rule of law, as well as greater social and economic freedoms. It is time for leaders to embrace reform and negotiate new social contracts with their citizens. We have seen in Latin America and in Eastern Europe that societies that transitions from authoritarian rule are turbulent, and progress is often made in fits and starts. Backsliding is common. It can be messy. A true democracy must be more than routine, free, and fair elections, although that is an important element. Democracy requires a broad-based institutional transformation that goes well beyond it all. It must include a respect for human rights, the autonomy and rights of the individual, the creation of an economy that inspires entrepreneurship and job growth, the inclusion of minority groups, including women, in the political process, the development of a free and independent media that operates without government censorship, and the freedom of assembly so that groups and civil society can self-organize without fear of political reprisal. These are the key ingredients. In Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country in the world, the government has made great strides towards a consolidated democracy following 5 decades of authoritarian rule. Here, its leaders have found a way to accommodate women's rights, democracy, and economic growth, but challenges remain. In Tunisia, it's encouraging that there is such a vigorous debate about the role of religion in the state, a debate that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. And I am hopeful that Tunisia will establish the democratic institutions that allow for long-term political stability and economic growth, that the Constitutional Assembly will avoid the pitfalls of the current provisional constitution and draft a final constitution that all Tunisians can support, one that enshrines the separation of powers in the different government branches and has strong protections for human rights, as well as social and political freedoms. In Egypt, there is clearly still much work to be done. There are some very troubling trends. However, I am hopeful that the transformation will succeed and that government will work with parties across the political spectrum to protect the basic rights and freedoms of the Egyptian people, particularly the rights of women and religious minorities. The process of learning to govern is far more difficult than occupying the position of the opposition. And violence against religious and ethnic minorities is intolerable, I might add. In Libya, its vast natural resources provide the opportunity to modernize and create jobs at great speed. Unfortunately, the wealth generated by these natural resources has been kept from the Libyan people for far too long, and now the country needs massive reinvestments in infrastructure, human capital, and state institutions. The new government is being tested by the presence of militias outside the major urban areas and historical animosities between interest groups. Each of the 3 Arab states included in today's discussion will ultimately have to forge their own path to democracy. Let me emphasize, democracy has to come from within. But while it must come from within, there are certain universal standards that must be abided by. For one, minorities must be protected. Again, I want to thank you for inviting me here today, and I wish you all a good discussion. And if I might begin with the introductions, I'd just like to introduce Ambassador Dino Djalal, who has represented Indonesia and Washington since September of 2010. Previously, he was special staff for international affairs and presidential spokesman from 2004 to 2009 for Indonesia's President Yudo. Dr. Djalal is the founder of, how do you pronounce it? Modernizator, a movement of progressive and reformist young leaders who embrace the slogan service, innovation, excellence, openness, connectivity. He conceived the Generation 21 program to develop a sense of unique identity and challenge among the youth who are the first generation of the 21st century. He is married to Rosa Djalal, and they have 2 daughters and 1 son. And Dr. Djalal, Ambassador, if you'd like to proceed.
And I asked the ambassador if I could have 1 second. Unfortunately, I'm sitting on the budget committee, and we are having a hearing right now, and I've got to leave. But I'm leaving my staff, Jessica Lee, here to watch what goes on and bring me news of it. So thank you. Pardon me for leaving.
Thank you, Congressman Royce and Congressman Jim McDermott. And thank you all the other fellow ambassadors for being here today. And first order of business is for me to pass on our most condolences of the attack in Boston yesterday. We condemn this senseless violence, and we hope that whoever did it will be apprehended and brought to justice. I'm pleased to be here to share a forum with my fellow ambassadors on transitions on democracy. Let me just begin by saying that in my view, Indonesia had it worse when we began our democratic transition than most of the Arab Spring countries. You know, our economy has contracted by 13%. We have political instability. We had, between 1998 and 2001, we had almost 1 president every year. We had violence and chaos in East Timor. Fighting worsened in Aceh and Papua. There were more violence in Ambon. There were constant riots and demonstrations. So we did not have it so good at all. This is, I think, the first lesson for Arab Spring countries, that things will get worse before they get better. But Indonesia's experience actually demonstrated that we could stabilize in about 3 and 4 years. And I think this is quite fast, because we noticed in some other transition countries it could take well over a decade for this to happen. But what I need to stress is that it was very critical to have faith in democracy at any turn of events. There were times that we were tempted to return to the old days. President Wahid at one point threatened to dissolve parliament, and some called for the return to authoritarian government when we had difficult times. But fortunately, we kept our faith in democracy, and it never happened. We got tougher in our course to stick with democracy and freedom. And as a result, Indonesia is now the 3rd largest democracy in the world, and arguably the strongest democracy in Southeast Asia. What are the lessons learned? Well, not just lessons, mistakes also. And I wish that our friends from Arab Spring countries can also learn from these mistakes and lessons. What are these? 1, get the first elections right. This is what happened when we had the first election in 1999. There were some procedural issues, and as a result, the person who received the most votes did not become president, which was President Ms. Megawati Soekarno Putri. And we spent about 1.5 years in political and constitutional crisis dealing with the aftermath of that. We wasted a lot of energy that should have been used to strengthen democracy and deliver development. Second, our experience showed that it was important to embrace and co-opt the power holders of the past. There were some calls for the Golkar party, the ruling party for so many years under Suharto, to be disbanded. We did not do that. In fact, we embraced them to join democracy and to take part in elections. They remain an important political party until now. But what is most important is we got the military on board. Now, this was very important because from the start, the military committed itself to support our reforms and to take themselves out of politics willingly and voluntarily. And they did this according to the time limit. Third, focus on building the system. Why? Because Indonesia's political system had been dominated by strong men, by personalities. And when the personality crumbled, the system also crumbled with it. Now we needed to build a place, a political order whereby it is the institutions that rule. It is the rule of law that became supreme. And individuals were secondary to the role of the system. Fourth, do not compromise democracy. There were many temptations for us to compromise our democratic development, especially as it happened immediately after 9/11. We had some terrorist attacks. We had some serious threat to our security, but never for a moment did we say we will compromise on lesser democracy and lesser freedom for us to protect, to advance our counterterrorism policy. So we advanced both democracy, human rights, as well as the promotion of greater security for Indonesia in a very difficult security environment nationally and internationally. And we believe we have succeeded in doing so. Fifth, expect a possibility whereby state authoritarianism would be replaced by mass authoritarianism. Now what I mean by this is that in the past past regimes, the threat to human rights had come usually from the state, right? Now in the democratic era, that is no longer the case, but we are seeing rising cases whereby mass authoritarianism is on the rise. Mass organizations will take matters into their own hands. They would force their views on others, impose their will on others, try to restrict the freedom of others. A lot of this is happening at the horizontal level and at the mass level, and this puts a strain on democracy. Fifth, reforms can lose steam. You can use the crisis to drive reforms, but crisis usually drive reforms for about 3 or 4 years. Crisis provide the rationale for the reforms, but after a while, when things get normalized, people forget the urgency about the reforms. So keep in mind that while reforms can lose steam, you need to find something else to drive reforms when the crisis is strong. And keep also in mind that people call themselves reformers, but there are all sorts of reformers. There are real reformers, there are semi-reformers, there are closet reformers, and there are actually pretender reformers. So what is very important, as Congressman Royce says, keep the momentum of the reform going. Put reformers in strategic posts, and sometimes the problem is the reformers in the country, in this case Indonesia, do not get along with one another. Right? Sometimes they don't group together and join forces to drive reforms, and they tend to compete with one another. The importance of leadership is also critical to our democratic development. Why is this? Because sometimes democracy can bring out the worst. What I mean by it, extremist groups come out and use the platform of freedom of speech to intimidate others and spread messages of hate, and so on and so on. There will be culture of cynicism rising in the beginning of democracy. In fact, in our case, it has become stronger. Civil society has become stronger, but civil society do not make decisions. Somebody has to make decisions, and difficult decisions, to make the governments run. And reforms need directions. They don't run on their own. Somebody has to make the plans, execute, and make the priorities. And for this, you need leadership. And if you ask me what is the most critical factor driving reform after the crisis has gone, it is leadership. And it is important for our leaders to resist the temptation to gain more power. In the early years when the system is being formed, there's always this temptation to gain more and more power at the expense of the other institutions. It's very important in our case to resist that temptation. And finally, it is very important to avoid the danger of democracy becoming elitist. And this has been the problem of what ruined the previous government in the first place. And the danger of democracy becoming elitist is always there. And we must avoid that. It is very important once you begin the democratic transition, as our experience has shown, take it as far and as fast as you can, run with it, and take it to a place where you reach a point of no return and democracy becomes irreversible. And when you reach to that point, it doesn't matter how many anti-reformers you have, how many hardliners you have, because by that time, that democracy has become the mainstream and cannot be taken away from the people. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Let me now introduce my colleague, His Excellency Mohamed Tawfik, Ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt. He was born in July 5th, 1956, and he has a degree from Cairo University, and master's degree from University of Patti. He's a new ambassador. He I think arrived a few months ago, and we were very pleased to have you. He has very distinguished diplomatic career, being ambassador to the Republic of Lebanon, to Australia, and other distinguished posts. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Djalal. I'd also like to thank Congressman Royce and McDermott, and my colleagues, the Ambassador of Libya and the Ambassador of Tunisia. At the outset, I would like to echo what Ambassador Djalal said about the bombings in Boston. We have been following, of course, these incidents with the utmost revulsion and condemnation. In Egypt, we have previous encounters with such explosions, and the people of Egypt invariably feel sympathy with all the victims. But in the end, I firmly believe that the values of humanity, the values of faith and a hope for a better future, these values will prevail. It's also an honor for me to address this very distinguished groups of people here in this bastion of democracy. I feel particularly privileged to represent my country as the first ambassador of Egypt to the United States to be nominated after the revolution. It's a revolution that took place on the 25th of January 2011, when millions of Egyptians, young and old, men and women, rich and poor, people of different religious faiths, belonging to a variety of political persuasions, stood hand in hand in Tahrir and other Egyptian squares to demand their basic rights to freedom and democracy. These great moments have changed the lives of every Egyptian, including myself, and indeed have inspired many people around the world. The Egyptian armed forces were quick to support the aspirations of the people and sided with their legitimate demands. Working through a difficult transition, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces succeeded in safeguarding the state's institutions and fulfilled its promise to seek power after presidential elections. In less than 2 years, Egypt succeeded in holding a series of free and fair referendums and elections, culminating in the swearing-in of the country's first democratically elected president, President Mohamed and the adoption of a new constitution. The participation, particularly of women and youth, during the different votes was impressive. People of all ages, persuasions stood in line for hours to cast their ballots, and the majority of all votes were cast by women. Electing the House of Representatives later this year will add an important building block to the new democratic constitutional framework, and will pave the way for Egyptians to exercise their newfound sense of empowerment through democratic institutions rather than taking to the street to express grievances or raise demands. Having said that, we must all agree that such periods of profound transformation are never easy. The lessons learned from other countries that have faced similar circumstances all seem to point to the fact that building new institutions is not enough. A new political culture must evolve, one that promotes dialogue and compromise. This will take both time and painstaking efforts, but we are committed to. Revolutions in their infancies are known to face economic challenges, and ours is no exception. Politically sensitive as it may be, the government is putting together an ambitious plan for Egypt's comprehensive economic reform. For such a plan to work, the Egyptian people must lend it its full support. That is why the government is keen to put its various aspects to a wide discussion among the different constituencies. The international community is pledged to support Egypt's democracy, to address the most pressing economic and social challenges. An IMF team was in Cairo recently to discuss how they can support Egypt's homegrown plan. The IMF's 4.8 billion contribution will be complemented by Egypt's other international partners. This will in turn encourage the Egyptian private sector and will help to attract foreign investments. As a practical demonstration of economic empowerment of all Egyptians, the statistics show new businesses being established at record rates. Today I can say with full confidence that Egypt is open for business. The United States has been at the forefront of international efforts to support Egypt's transition to democracy. From very early on, President Obama publicly backed the Egyptian people's quest for democracy. In May 2010, he announced an economic assistance package for Egypt. 2011, economic assistance package for Egypt. Last month, Secretary Kerry announced in Cairo the release of $215 million, 190 million of which have gone to support Egypt's budget. The remaining 60 million will form the nucleus of an enterprise fund geared to help small and medium enterprises. The Egyptian people greatly appreciate these acts of solidarity. The relations between our two countries will remain a cornerstone for peace and stability in the Middle East. Time and again, Egyptians have drawn from their millennium of experience and civilization to find solutions to apparent impasses. Just as they succeeded in overthrowing a dictatorship through sheer willpower and peaceful demonstrations, they shall, I am confident, accomplish their mission in leading the region towards a stable, prosperous, and democratic future.